Welcome to the Northwest Accounting Educators 2015 Conference. Excel 2013 pivot tables from A to Z. Large data sets into useful information the easy way. Hey, this is going to be a great video. And if you want to follow along by downloading this file, click on the link below the video and use the keyboard Control-N to go to the bottom to the last section, because there's a lot of files, and look for the Northwest Accounting Educator section. And this file for 2015 will be there. Now, in this video, we have a bunch of topics. We're going to start off by talking about the basics of PivotTable from 0 to high speed in a quick amount of time. And then we're going to take some time and do a couple major reports, including this business one that has like 50,000 rows of data. Then we're going to talk about some of the newer features in 2013 that allow us to do some power features, including our last example where we'll take 500,000 rows of data and import it using Power Query and watch the file size dramatically get reduced in size. All right, so we're going to start right at the essence of a pivot table. So we're going to go over to the sheet 01 Essence. And I have a question for you. This is just a simple data set. And all data sets have field names or column headers at the top. So we have sales reps and units. This is a proper data set. Anytime we use a pivot table, we're going from a proper data set into. And what is that? What is it that the pivot table does? Well, it always will take raw data and do some sort of calculation with conditions or criteria. So over here, we can clearly see that Mo had 2 records, and the total should be 8. But notice, that means we had to do adding, not everything from here, but adding with the condition Mo. So what we did here is we went from raw data into useful information, always doing some calculation. And here we did a sum with a condition or criteria, and the criteria condition was sales rep name. The other way you think about it is pivot tables make summary reports. But more specifically, pivot tables are always doing some calculation with some number of conditions or criteria. Now here's another example, student, class, and grade. If I go from raw data into useful information, here my criteria is student name. But notice I'm calculating an average based on the grade column. So pivot tables always make calculations with criteria or conditions. Here we did an average calculation with a single condition. More generally stated, hey, that is a summary report for student GPA. Now I want to, before we talk about the details, I just want to go over to this 01 Essence 2 and create those 2 pivot tables in just a few clicks. Now I'm actually going to hold Control and roll the wheel on my mouse to zoom in. Now click in one cell in the first table, Insert, Pivot Table. It's guessing the right range. I click Existing, Location, click in E1 and click OK. I drag sales rep down to rows, units sold down to values, and in just a few clicks, I have created my summary report. Now we're going to fix that row labels and a few other things when we look at more details, but all we're seeing here is that took about 4 clicks. Now let's try it for this other one. Click in one cell in the pivot table. Insert Pivot Table. I'll count that as 2 clicks so far. Existing. I'll count that as 4 clicks. Drag student down to rows. Instantly, look at that. Grade down to values. We got about 5 clicks. Oh, look at that. It's sum. All numbers will default to the sum. Right click, summarize values by, and I'm going to choose average. And just like that, that is amazing. 2 quick summary reports, each with calculations with a single condition. Here we're adding by sales rep. Here we're calculating a student grade point average based on the student name. Now, before we talk more about the amazing pivot table, we got to go over and talk about a proper data set. So I'm going to click on O2 proper data set. Now, here is a proper data set here, and here's our 5 important points that define a proper data set. Column headers or field names in the first row. Each one of these field names says what kind of data goes in this column. Field name, that means the major, the class they took, and the grade. Without field names, you cannot do data analysis because, in essence, we ask questions of each one of these columns, or we use the columns as criteria for our conditions. So field names have to be in the first row. Each one of these is a record, and records are in row. If you see Anita, there's 1, 2, 3 different entries into this table for Anita. Her major is always biology. She took 3 different classes and 3 different grades. The next point is empty spaces. You have to have empty spaces all the way around your data set. Now, I want to jump to the bottom, and I'm going to teach you this keyboard Control down arrow to jump to the bottom. You can see we have about 300 and plus records. But notice empty cells all the way around your proper data set. Or you can have your Excel row headers, which are numbers, or your Excel column headers, which are letters. Now, I'm going to Control up arrow to jump back up to the top of that data set. Now, you also want to have no empty field names. If this were deleted, then we wouldn't be able to do data analysis on this column because we wouldn't know what it is, and the pivot table user interface would not know what to list this as. So Control Z to undo that. You also want to try number 5 here, not to have empty cells in your data set, although that one is hard to enforce. Sometimes in the real world, your data sets do have empty cells. But the first 4, field names in the top, empty cells all the way around, records in rows, and no empty field names. Those have to be true for us to be able to have a proper data set and use it in a pivot table. Now, how do we know how to make a pivot table like this one? That looks complicated. Here's the deal. We're going to visualize one report and this second report. We visualize them up front, and then when we get to our pivot table user interface, it's much easier. Now look at here. This report, and this is just a picture of a finished pivot table. It looks like the student name is at the head of each row, and then there's a calculation. So Anita, 2.3. That meant the pivot table went through and found all of the Anita records, got all of the grades, and made a calculation with the criteria Anita, and then did an average calculation. Now notice at the head of each row, so that means when we get to our pivot table user interface, we'll drag student name down to the row area and our grade down to the value area where we make our calculation. Now look at this pivot table. It looks like we have major at the top of each column and our class name at the head of each row. So right here, that 2.7, that is a calculation with 2 criteria or conditions. Biology is the major. The class is Biology 160. So that's an average calculation made with 2 conditions. That's the essence of our pivot table. But if we're going to construct this, we have to realize that at the top of each column is major. So when we get to the user interface, we'll drag major to the column area. And for the row header, we'll drag class down to the row area. Then we drag grade down and change the calculation to average, and we're done. So when you're learning pivot tables, this trick of visualizing your report up front helps you understand where to drag and drop the fields. Now let's go ahead and go over to O2 Basics, and we're going to create both of these pivot table reports. So I'm going to click on O2 Basics. All right, I'm going to scroll down a little bit. There's our data set. Click in a single cell. Insert, pivot table. And here's the pivot table dialog box. Now, it will always guess right if you have empty cells all the way around or row or column headers. So step 1 is pretty much always automatic. Step 2 is just, hey, where do you want to put it? A lot of times when you have big reports, you like them on a new sheet, so that's the default. We're going to go ahead and put this one on the existing worksheet. So I'm going to click in Location and try and click in cell F16. Click OK. Now here's my pivot table field list. Remember, we want student name down in the row area. So I'm going to drag student down to row. And instantly, look at that. I get what's called a unique list or a distinct list. The pivot table went through this whole student name field with lots of duplicates and instantly extracted and listed each item only one time. That's pretty amazing in itself. Now we want to calculate on grade, so we go to grade and click and drag down to the values areas. Now notice, if it's a number, it's going to default to sum, but that's no problem. We can come and in one cell, right click, summarize values as, and I'm going to say average. Instantly, I have my basic report. Now, when we're building pivot tables, there's a few important things. The first one is the default layout for pivot table says row labels, and that's not a good label to have in a report. It should say students. So every time you create a pivot table with one cell selected, you go up to the Pivot Table Tools, Special Context Sensitive Ribbons, click on Design, and then over in the Layout group, we're going to say Report Layout, and you either choose Outline or Tabular. Tabular will show the field name and show the gray lines. Outline will show the field name and no gray lines. I'm going to choose tabular. The second thing is number formatting. Notice we don't want to see all those decimals. Now, number formatting doesn't change the underlying number. That unrounded number will still be in the cell, but we can format the surface of the spreadsheet with number formatting. Now, normally in Excel spreadsheet, you highlight all the cells that you want to format. But this is a pivot table. That is a field. That's the grade field. So we can select a single cell and right click and do not select Format Cells. If you click Format Cells, it brings up the Format Cells dialog box with all of the tabs. You know for sure you've selected the wrong thing when you select and see all the tabs. You want to right click and point to number formatting. By the way, if you were in the cells over here, notice that right click, that doesn't show up. There's no number formatting at all, but there is a format cell. So inside the field, right click, and there's that cool little number formatting. And you can tell it's going to format the field because there's only one tab. I'm going to select number. 2 decimals is fine, and click OK. And instantly, we have added number format to display the number. Now, notice if you look up into the formula bar, you can see the unrounded number is still there. But that's how we display. That's looking pretty amazing. It is a summary report. Our condition is in the row area, and our calculation with a single condition averaged off of our grade column is in the values area. Now, let's create that second report. And remember, we visualize up front, major in the column, class in the row. So I go back over to O2 Basics, a single cell. And wait a second. If you're creating a lot of pivot tables, we do not want to go to Insert and click Pivot Table every time. We want to teach ourselves the keyboard. Now, there's a special key on your keyboard, the Alt key. So hit the Alt key. Just tap it once. And notice what happens. Up in our ribbons and quick access toolbar, we see a bunch of screen tips. So if I want to get to Insert, I have to click N. Now, I'm going to tap it. Alt keys are succession. I hit Alt and then let go. Now I'm going to hit N and then let go. And I'm noticing that there's a V, so now I hit V. That is pretty amazing. Now I'm going to click Escape because after a while you just go Alt N V and boom, there you go. It got it right because there's empty cells all the way around. I want it on a new worksheet. So I could click OK. But notice any dialog box that has a highlighted button, that means that the Enter key will enact that button. So I hit Alt-N-V and then Enter. Now watch this. I'm going to try this again. Alt-N-V and Enter. And instantly on a new sheet, I have my field list in my emerging pivot table. Now I'm immediately going to name this. I'm going to double click and call this something smart like class, major, GPA, and enter. Now let's look at the pivot table field list. There's columns, filter, and rows. All of these are the areas in the pivot table that you can drag and drop criteria. Whatever you drag down into values is the field we make the calculation upon. So remember, we wanted class. So I'm going to click and drag down to rows. Instantly, I get my unique list. Exactly one of each class from that class column. Now I drag major to the columns. Instantly, I get a unique list. One each of all of the majors from our major column. We drag grades down to the values area. That is just profound. Now think about that. For any one of these intersecting cells here, that is a ridiculous number. 11.5, man, I would love to have a GPA of 11.5. Oh, remember, the default calculation for numbers is sum. So I'm simply going to click in any one cell, right click, summarize values by and average. Look at that. Now think about this. Any one of these intersecting cells is a calculation with two conditions. The GPA for biology majors taking business 210 is 3.25. That is simply amazing how fast we can do calculations with conditions or criteria using a pivot table. Now, we don't like these row labels or column labels, so immediately go up to Design, Report Layout, and I'm going to select Tabular. I want to change the number formatting. This is one field down here, so I click in any one field, right-click Number Formatting. And instantly, I can choose whichever number formatting I want. Number with 2 decimals is fine. Click OK. That is looking pretty good. Now, I want to look at some more aspects of the pivot table. And let's drag these both off. That is the overall GPA for all the students from our data set. And I just want to show you what happens if you use the check mark approach, which is how they design this. It always will drop your criteria down into the rows. And in general, you can check, check, check. And sometimes things will go into the wrong places. So that's why I tend to use the drag and drop, because then I'm not going to have to mess around. They're going to drag and drop to the right place. Now, I also want to look at why they gave the pivot table the pivot table name. Let's just imagine that you actually did want to see class and then major underneath. Now, this is a nice cross-tabulated report, but your boss says, hey, I want to see the report a different way. Let's pivot the whole report. So I'm going to drag columns down to rows. And just like that, that is amazing. Now, I could drag class up to columns. I could pivot this however I want. I'm going to go ahead and pivot it back. We're going to have class and major. Now, I want to go back over to O2 Basics and show you an alternative for this report. Notice we have two conditions, class and major. So let's go back over to O2 Basics. And we're actually going to see one of the more cool features since Excel 2010 called the slicer. I'm going to click in a single cell, Alt-NV. I'm going to put it on an existing sheet. And by the way, the fact that that E is underlined means you can hold the Alt and hit E, and it selects it. Then I could click in any particular cell I wanted. I'm going to click on J16 and click OK. Now I'm going to scroll over a little bit, and I'm going to try and make the same report. It looked like we had class down to rows, instantly a unique list. We had grade to values. Right-click, summarize values by average. Right-click, number formatting. Number 2 is good. Click OK. Up to Design, over to Report Layout, and Show in Tabular. Now, we could drag major down to filter. That's the third area that you're allowed to drag criteria. And it will offer us a drop down. Right now it says all. I can click the drop down and select art. And instantly I'm filtering this whole data set on art only. If I click on accounting and click OK, instantly my whole data set is filtered. Now notice what's happening here. We have 1, 2. So that means any intersecting cell is a calculation with 2 conditions. In this cell right here, GPA 2.45, that's biology 175 for accounting majors. Now I'm going to click and drag this away. And instead of using the filter here, in a single cell, I'm going to go up to the Pivot Table Tools, Analyze. And over here in the Filter group, we have Insert Slicer. So I'm going to click that. And you can choose whichever one you want. I'm going to select Major. And when I click OK, it's going to add a slicer. Oh, look, and just before we fix it up, notice, oh, that is so cool. It's much easier than that little drop down we had in the cell over here. Now we can come up to our context sensitive ribbon, slicer tools, options. I can say columns 1, 2, 3, for example, or no, let's leave it 2. And then resize it, click and drag. You could change the color if you wanted. So now I can simply come over, and there's my pivot table. Here's my slicer. When I click Art, any one of these cells has a condition from the class column and one from major. Each one of these calculations is a calculation done with 2 conditions or criteria. Now, if I want to get rid of the criteria from my slicer, I come up and I click Get rid of the filter. Now we're back to 1 condition. Each one of the intersecting cells is simply grade point average with whatever class is at the row header. Now, another thing you might want to do from time to time is select items that are not next to each other. How did I do that? Well, I selected accounting first, and then I held the Control key to select business. Now I have 2 conditions on major and 1 on English. All right, so I'm going to clear this. Now we're back to a single condition. All right, so that's pretty amazing. That's some of the basics of pivot tables, including our last example with a slicer. Now we want to go over and look at some examples. We're going to go over to O3 HR for human resources. And here's our task. We want to create a report that shows us how many in each department. Whoa, we're given this whole list here. And then we need to calculate the total hours. There's the hours worked last year for each department. Now let's click in the top cell and Control down arrow. So this is only 50 records or something like that. Control up arrow. So it's not too many. But how do you do it with a pivot table? It is easy. Let's click in a single cell. And let's do our keyboard. Alt-N-V. And I'm going to put it on this sheet. So Alt-E. Click in, let's say, G5, and click OK. Now watch this. I'm going to scroll over with the horizontal bar. We want department, and we need a unique list in the row area. So I click and drag down to rows. That's beautiful. But now how do we count how many in each? Well, now we're going to do something different. We're going to drag the very same field, which happens to be text, and we drag it down to values. Now, the default calculation for text values is not sum. It's always count. So look at that. If we have a column of items and we need to quickly get a count, drag down to rows, drag down to values, and boom, we have our count for each department. This is also called a frequency table. Now, we don't like that, so we come up to Design, Report Layout, and Show in Tabular. I'm going to click Escape to close that ribbon. That's amazing. Now watch this. Here's another great trick. Once you have your report formatted and you want to make a simple change, I'm going to Control-C for the entire pivot table. And when I click below, and by the way, this is a dangerous move. If I ever pivoted, and notice when I click inside this pivot table, the field list for this table shows up. If I ever pivoted this and it all of a sudden expanded downward, that would mess up the pivot table below. But I'm going to be risky here. I'm going to Control-V. And there we go. It was total hours we wanted. So I'm going to come over and drag my count away. And now drag hours down to values. And boom, look at that. Sum of hours worked last year. I'm just going to click here and type a name for this field. I'm just going to say total hours and enter. By the way, notice that by copying and pasting, we didn't have to change the report layout. because we copied a pivot table that had that layout, it automatically appeared down here. Now, one thing we might want to do is right-click, and how about number formatting? And I'm going to say number to get the comma, but I definitely don't want decimals because this is counting full hours. Click OK, and there we go. Now notice when I change something in this pivot table down here, it automatically changed the column width. There's a setting we can change. Right-click and Pivot Table Options. If there's ever something tricky going on, sometimes right-clicking and going to Options in whatever part of Excel will do the trick. I'm going to try this. And there's a bunch of tabs here. Right on the first one, Layout and Format. Auto fit column widths on update. So now when I click OK, if I were to drag this off, drag this down, notice it doesn't change. If I drag this off and hours worked, it doesn't change. Now I'm going to Control Z, 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 Z to go back. That's the keyboard for undo. All right, so that's a pretty cool example there. Now let's go over and look at our next example on sheet 04, sum product by month and year. And we are going to see two of the more beloved features in a pivot table, grouping by dates and the absolutely amazing show report filter page tricks. Now, here's our data set. This is date, sales rep, units, product, region, and net revenue. Let's do Control down arrow. Wow, so it looks like we have our first big data set. That's like 50,000 rows. Control up arrow. And we need to create this report. Now, this is going to involve grouping by month and year, and then also adding the product. Now, actually, we're going to do a bunch of different reports based on those different criteria. Click in a single cell, Alt-N-V, and Enter, because we're putting it on a new sheet. I'm immediately going to double-click and call this Net Revenue Month and Year, and Enter. Now, here's our field list. And notice if we drag the date down to the rows, we always get a unique list. Now, actually, if we drag net revenue down to values and then right-click number formatting, change it to currency, and I'm going to, even though there's decimals there, I'm going to hide them to display no decimals. This is a high-level summary report, so we don't need to see those pennies. But this report right here is very useful. This is a daily sales report, but that's not what we want. I'm going to come over to the date inside the pivot table, right-click, and there it is. Almost the #1 most beloved feature in a pivot table, group. Now, we can group by months, but that would give us many, many different years all in January, February, so I don't want that. Just click. We don't have to hold Control. Just click on the two fields you want to group. And notice you can group by minutes, hours, days, quarters, but we want months and years. Click OK. And you got to be kidding me. That's just a few clicks, and instantly I have my year and my months. There's all the net revenue from that daily transactional data. Year, month, year, month. So we'll go all the way down. We have all the way down to 17. Now, check this out. This report is kind of nice here. But notice down here we have a new field called years. It's up in our field list. The date, I wish they would have added it so it said month, but that date is actually month. I want to drag years over to columns. Wow, look at that report. That is beautiful. A few clicks, we have month, year, and all of our net revenue. Now, I don't like those row labels, so design, report layout, show in tabular. All right, so that's our first basic report. Now, one interesting thing about if we go back to the sheet 04 sum product with our raw data, once we group, if we make a new report, that date will still be grouped. I want to create a new report. It's going to have year, month from the date column and product. So I'm going to click in a single cell, Alt-N-V, and Enter onto a new sheet. Double click. Now I call this month and year product master because this is going to have the total for all the products, and we're going to see an amazing feature to create as many pivot tables as you want for the individual products with just a click. Now let's go ahead, and we only want to see year here, so I'm going to drag year, this new field there. Look at that. We get a unique list, one of each year. Revenue. I'm immediately going to come over and right click number formatting, and let's do currency, no decimals. Now that's our net revenue, but we want to fancy this report up. We actually want to show the revenue for each year, but then we want to show the change and the percentage change. What we need to do is drag the net revenue 2 times, and this is going to look ridiculous. We're repeating ourselves. Look at that, the same numbers without the formatting. But watch this. We can come to this new field, right click, and we looked at summarize values by before. We can change it to any one of these functions, or there's 11 functions if you click more options. But watch this. Show values as has all sorts of amazing options. Now we're going to do difference from and percentage difference from. Later in this video, we'll see some of the percentage of grand total and percentage of column total. But if you look through this list, there are some amazing calculations. How about running total if you wanted a running total for January, February, March? And these are all automatic. Let's click difference from, and instantly, for this particular field, since we're calculating a difference, it needs to know the base field, which is year. Boop, boop, boop. And the base item. Now we could base all the differences off of a solid year, 2012, but I want to do it off the previous. All right, so now I click OK, and look at that. There's the difference between each one of the years. Right click, number formatting, and we'll do the same currency, no decimals, click OK. Now let's do percentage difference from. Right click, show values as. All of this power, that is just amazing inside of a pivot table. Percentage difference from. The base item is going to be previous. Click OK. That is amazing. Now I want to change the row label. So design, report layout, show in tabular. Now we can look down here in our pivot table field list, and we see our values. I'm actually going to pull this down so we can pull this and expand it so we can see those. Those aren't very good names. So let's come over, and I'm going to call this net revenue. But here's a problem. If I try to hit enter, there's already a field named net revenue, and they won't let you rename a column the same as a field. So here's a trick that's been around since the beginning of pivot tables. Type a space, and there we go. Now when I hit enter, that will work. This would be called change tab, and this would be called percentage change, and enter. Now we have our base master report. But now what do we need? Here's the master. I want individual sheets for each one of the products. So we could do this manually. There's the product. I could drag it down to filter. Right now at the top, it shows all. I could select from the drop-down Bellin, click OK, copy the sheet over, and then come up and select Carlota. Click OK, copy the sheet over. But no way. There's an amazing feature called Show Report Filter Pages. So I'm going to leave it on all. And my goal is to insert a bunch of new sheets. So there's my base table. All the formatting and everything is perfect. I come up to Analyze. Over in Options, I find Show Report Filter Pages. Now it's a little bit buried. Analyze, Options, Show Report Filter Pages. But it is profound what this can do. Now we only have one field dropped up into our filter, so I only see one there. But when I click OK, watch. It will create a new sheet, one for each product. So when I click OK, there's the Bellin. We can see the Bellin up there. There's the Carlota. As I scroll forward, or actually I'm going to use the keyboard Control Page Down. Control Page Down. Each one of these, you could see the quad with a quad sheet, all done with Show Report Filter Pages. That is absolutely amazing. Now that was looking at two amazing features, the ability to group by month and year, and also our show report filter pages. Now we want to scroll over and look at another important example, how to create a histogram. So I'm going to click on the sheet 05 histogram. And here we have our student, major, class, and grade column. And we need to count how many grades are in certain categories. We're going to go from 0 to 0.5, 0.5 to 1, all the way up to 3.5 grade to 4. Again, these are categories. We need to count how many grades are in each category. And then we make a histogram chart to display that visually. Now, when we put this through a pivot table, we can say, hey, pivot table, group this, and it will automatically give us 0 to 0.5. 0.5 to 1, etc. And then we simply drag our grade, and it will count for us. But we got to be careful. These are decimal numbers, and pivot table groups integers and decimals differently. When we have a decimal, it will yield ambiguous labels, and we'll fix that. But the important thing is, if we give it a lower and upper value, like 3.5 as the lower, and 4 as the upper. The 4 will not be included in the count for that category, but the lower 3.5 will. So when we group, we'll be sure to think about this explicitly. And there's a note so you don't get confused. Click in a single cell, Alt-N-V, and Enter. I'm going to immediately call this histogram. Double-click, histogram, and Enter. Now we can take our grade, and when we drag it down to rows, just like dates, we get a unique list. Now I'm going to right-click, Group. And here's where we have to be careful. It says 0 to 4. Since I know if I have the last category of 3.5 to 4, the 4 would not be included. I'm actually going to say end at 4.5. Now we could change the labels later when they spit out, but internally that's what we're going to do because our increment, which they call by, is 0.5. So now when I click OK, instantly it gives us enough categories to count all the grades. When we drag grade to values, watch what happens. It defaults to count because it sees this as a label. Now these labels are ambiguous, so I'm going to look at a trick here. I'm actually going to highlight all of them, and instead of typing each one individually, I'm simply going to search for a dash and replace it with something. I'm going to use the command home, find and select, and we're going to say replace. And I'm going to use the keyboard Control H. Now I want to find that little dash, so I'm going to put a dash. And I'm going to replace it with an explicit label that lists the comparative operator and the variable. Remember, we're trying to find a grade between 0 and 0.5. So I'm going to put a space greater than or equal to, and then the variable grade, and then less than. This is from algebra. You might have seen this. That means the variable grade is in between a lower and an upper, and the grade has to be greater than or equal to, in our case, 0, and less than 0.5. Now I'm going to click Replace All, and instantly we get what we want. Click OK, click Close, change the column width. Now I don't like that label up there, so I go to Design, Report Layout, and Show in Tabular. Now that's a quick and easy way to create a count of all the grades from a data set, but we need to visualize this. I'm going to highlight the two names at the top and our label, which will be on the horizontal axis, and the height of our column will come from the count of grades. Insert, column, and I want the column chart. Now I'm going to click and drag this. I'm going to close the field list, and there's our basic chart. Now we're going to fix this up a little bit. I don't need these gray fields, which are nice. It means you can filter, but I'm going to right-click and say Hide All Field Buttons on Chart. This is not a good label up here. I'm going to click on it and start typing. And notice when I'm typing, it appears up in the formula bar, not where you expect it. And when I hit Enter, there's my title. That is chart junk right there. We do not need it. Delete. I want to click on the columns. And we're going to learn two new things about Excel 2013 charting. I need to change the column width so that there's no gap width here. And the reason that we do that is that these categories are continuous categories, and there's nothing that can fit between the two categories. That's why we want to visually portray that by having no gap width. Now I've selected the column. All the columns are selected. And I'm either going to right-click Format Data Series, or I'm going to use the keyboard Control-1. This is a task pane. This is new in Excel 2013. It used to be dialog boxes, but now we can change the gap width to 0. If we want, we can come over to the paint bucket, and I could say fill. You could change it. I'm going to say vary colors by point. I'm going to come down to border, select solid line, and down here I'm going to select a black line. Now the second thing about Excel 2013 charts is this green plus. If I click on it, it allows us to add things like axis titles, which we want, and data labels. We can have the actual frequency or count at the top. I'm going to click on that to make it go away. This axis title is selected, so I'm going to type an equal sign. Notice it shoots me up to the formula bar. And then I'm going to say count of grades and enter. I have linked the chart title to the cells. Down here, I'm going to say equals. It shoots me up here. Click on that and enter. Now I'm going to come to this cell and hit F2 to put in edit mode. And I'm going to type grade, category, and enter. Notice because I changed it here, it automatically reflected the change because this label is linked. Now I have a count here and a count here. That's chart junk, so I'm going to click on this axis and hit delete. I also don't think I want these lines, so I'm going to click on the lines internally. I don't want to click on the outside. I want to click on inside. When I see all those little translucent circles, I can hit the delete key. And there, from a pivot table, I have created a histogram. Now I can see I made a mistake over here. If I highlight this, and I'm going to change the less than symbol to less than and a space, so Control H. I'm searching for less than tab, and I want to put less than and a space. Now when I say replace all, click OK, click close, it changes it here, and it changes it over in our chart. Now, that's a histogram and a pivot table. Let's go over and look at our next example. And we're going to go over to 06 XL 2013, 2 tables. Yes, we're actually going to build a pivot table from 2 separate tables. Now, this trick does not work in earlier versions. It's only XL 2013 and later. And here's the deal. We're given date, sales rep, product, and net revenue. But we're asked to create a regional report. Now notice, click in the top cell, Control down arrow. So there's 10,000 records here. Control up arrow. Well, each one of these sales rep has another table over here. Control down arrow. So it's not very big. It's about 70 employees. And from this unique list of sales reps, we have our region. So we can see Andrew's in the West. Ben is in the West. So really, before Excel 2013, we'd add a helper column with the VLOOKUP function, copy that formula down, and then build our pivot table from one table. No way. In 2013, we can link these two tables with a relationship, and then we'll be able to simply drag region from this field, net revenue from this second table, and boom, the pivot table will work. Now, one thing about this trick is that each table has to be converted to an Excel table. And I've already done it for this table over here, but I need to do it for this table. So I'm going to click in a single cell, Insert Table. Now, what is a table anyway? A table does a bunch of things. It adds format, and it has these drop downs here with lots of convenient features like sorting and filtering. But the main thing it will do is if I add records to the bottom, everything pointing to the table, formulas, charts, pivot tables will update. So I'm going to click in this cell, and I'm actually going to use the keyboard Control T. and click OK. Just like that, I have converted it to an official Excel table. Now I want to go up to Design and name this table, and I'm going to call this Sales Rep and Enter. Now watch this. Click in a single cell, Alt-N-V, and very importantly, it got the name of the table right here, F Transactions. And we're going to put it on a new worksheet, but here's the trick. I want to click Add to Data Model. Now, what the data model is a columnar database that's built into Excel. Now, to get the full power of the columnar database, you actually have to install or buy PowerPivot. And what the PowerPivot add-in does is it gives you full control over the DAX formula language. But if you just want to connect your two tables and use your pivot table, you add it to the data model, and it adds it to that special columnar database. Click OK, and where this is going to appear on a new sheet. Now we have active and all. If we go over to all, I see the transaction table and the sales rep table. Now when you see that black line on the top, that means it's been added to the data model. This has not been added to the data model yet. But let's proceed and see what happens, because I can expand both tables. And sure enough, and I'm going to pull this down at the bottom, sure enough, right here in the middle, I can see fields from both tables. And watch this. I'm going to drag region down to rows. And sure enough, I get exactly what I expect, a unique list of regions. But now let's try this. I'm coming over, and I'm going to try and drag net revenue down to values. And I'm going to get a surprising result, the same number. That's the grand total for every single one. Now, what happens is, because there's no relationship between the tables, we get this relationship yellow button. And I'm going to say Create. It's going to give us this dialog box. And the trick is if you know databasing, you have to know what a primary key is. But for us, when we're using VLOOKUP, the VLOOKUP table has to have a unique list. And in our case, that's a unique list of sales rep. So the actual related table, or in databasing, the one with the primary key or the unique list, is going to be our sales rep. And then we come over here and select sales rep. Now we come up, and the table is going to be the transaction. So the table is the one that would get the VLOOKUP if you were using the VLOOKUP formula, and this would be the lookup table. All right, so we are going to create this relationship, click OK, and instantly the yellow goes away, and there's our table. We are totally allowed to drag and drop from these two tables and do whatever we want. I could drag product over here and get a cross-tab table based on a relationship between the two tables. Now I'm going to come down and name this sheet. Actually, I'm going to drag product off or uncheck it. That's all I wanted to do. Actually, before we name the sheet, let's go up to Design, Report Layout, and Show in Tabular. Right-click, Number Formatting, Currency, no decimals, click OK. Then I can come down here and call this, I said pivot table from two tables. That is amazing. All right, let's scroll over. That was example number 6. I'm actually going to close all of these task panes. Scoot this over a little bit. That was example 6. We need to go over and look at example 7. So I'm going to click on 07 PQ for Power Query Unpivot feature. Now, our goal on this sheet is to create a cross-tabulated report to show data entry error rates by year. Here's the problem. This is not a proper data set. We should have one column with year and one column with errors from that year, either yes or no. So we need to do what's called unpivot. I need to take all of these years, put them in a separate column, but have 2011 associated with all these yeses and nos, 2012 associated with all these yes and nos, and so on. If we could unpivot this it would work perfectly. Now, what is Power Query? In Excel 2010 and 2013, Power Query is a free download. It's super easy. You know, sometimes downloads are difficult and complicated. You just Google download Power Query. It takes about 1 minute to download it and install it. And here it is. Now, in this video, we'll see this 2 times. It is unbelievable how it can transform data. All right, I'm going to click Escape. Click down here. Oh, and just like the data model, in order to use Power Query, you have to use the Excel table feature. Now, what's so amazing about Power Query, if you've ever done any data transformation and you had to repeat it when the data changes, that's not the case with Power Query. Power Query allows you to click a few buttons, and when it exports the new transformed data, if you ever update it, because it's in an Excel table which expands and contracts, all you do is refresh, and your Power Query refreshes also. And we'll actually see an example of that. All right, so I'm going to click in the cell and Control-T to convert it to a table. Click OK. I want to immediately go up to Design, Properties, and call this Yearly Error Data, and Enter. Now, with a single cell, I can go up to Power Query and say, from table, please bring this data into the Power Query data transformation window. Now, it shows me a preview here. And for this first example, all we have to do is select the 4 columns. So I'm going to click the first one. And before I click on the last one, I'm going to click Shift. And that way I've selected them all. And I go over to Transform. And there it is, Unpivot Columns. You got to be kidding me. It totally did it perfect. Now we want to name this. So I'm going to double click and call this Year. Enter. Double click this and call this Error. Enter. Now I'm looking over here. It's got the name from that table, which is fine. Here's our steps. When I say Home, close and load to, and it's actually going to create a new table. Or you could, in other situations, you only create a connection, which we'll see an example of that, our last example. But I'm going to create a table. I'm going to dump it on this existing sheet, click the Collapse button, and I'm going to put it right next to, actually, I'm going to put it a few over, and click OK. Click Load. There's our new table. We can scroll over. There is our query. And if I close this, if I ever need to see that again, I come up to Power Query and say Show Pane, and there it is. Click Close. That's our new table. That is pretty amazing. That is one example of how to use Power Query to transform your data. Now I'm going to create a pivot table. And I'm actually going to Control and Roll, Alt and V, and I'm going to put this on a new sheet and Enter. Now I have my pivot table field list that I can drag over here. And watch this. I'm going to drag Year down to Columns, Error down to Rows, and then Error down to Values. And now it's counting. I immediately want to say Design, Report Layout, Show in Tabular. Now I want to copy this pivot table because I want 2 tables. Control-C, and I'm going to paste it below, Control-V. And I need to change the calculation. Now think about this. I need error rates. That means percentage of yes and no for our data entry errors for each one of the years. So I want to take a percentage of the column total for no, percentage of the column total for yes, and then do that for each one of these. So simply right-click, Show Values As. And here's a great example for a percentage of column total. And just like that, there are my error rates. Wow, so we did Power Query to transform the original data set, and then we saw another example of Show Values As. Now I'm going to come down here and double-click. Call it something smart like Error Report. Now that was example 7, Control Home. Now I actually want to add some new data to this Excel table, then see that Power Query output will update, and then our error report will update. I have some data over here for 2015. I'm going to use Control asterisk on the number pad to highlight all of that data. Control C to copy. And watch this. The Excel table feature is smart enough to know that if I paste Control V, a new column directly next to it, it will incorporate it. Now I'm going to Control down arrow because 2011 had the most yeses and nos. And notice it totally worked. Control up arrow, it got exactly what we wanted. Control home to jump up to cell A1. Now let's come over here and right-click refresh. And no way, Control down arrow and scroll up a little bit, and you can see we have interspersed in here some 2015. Now I'm going to Control home. So the Power Query updated by just right-click refresh. Let's go over to our pivot table. I'm going to click in this first one right here, right-click refresh. And then come up here and change the column. Let's notice I'm going to highlight all of them and click and drag one of them. That is absolutely amazing. The pivot tables incorporated the 2015 data, Power Query updated, all because we had our Excel table and added an extra column. Now we want to see two more examples of Power Query. I'm going to click on 08 Power Query Clean to Report. Now here we just want a regional sales report. But notice we have to clean this data. We have product group and region together. So we could do text to columns, clean it up, and then make a pivot table. But we want to see how to use Power Query to allow us to actually clean the data and create this basic report. So I'm going to click in the cell, Control T, and Enter. Now I'm going to go up to Design, Properties, or Alt-JTA. If you do a lot of tables and naming, that's a good one to know. And I'm going to call this Sales Table and Enter. Now I'm going to click in a single cell, go up to Power Query from Table. Now the first thing we want to do is we want to click on the region column. And lo and behold, there's a split feature. So I'm going to say split by delimiter. Now, if you ever used text to columns before, you know we're limited to a single character, but not here. I'm going to click Custom. And down in the delimiter, I'm going to type a colon and a space. Because if I didn't have that space, if we ever wanted to use the product group column, there would be freestyle, but there would be a space. There'd be doublers, but a space. So by using two delimiters here, when I click OK, it will split. Now I'm going to rename these columns. And I'm going to double click and call this region. Enter. Now we're actually not going to use that, but I had to show you that cool two delimiter trick. We're actually not going to use this in our final report, and we're not going to use this. Now get this, we're actually building the report. We're not exporting this as a table that we're going to build a pivot table from. So we're actually going to, in Power Query, remove these two columns. So I highlighted them both, right-click Remove. Now I simply have region and sales. And over here, home, there's the group by. Now, if you know Access, group by is a term they use there. But all it means is it's going to give us a unique list of the field we group by and the total. So I'm going to say group by. I want to group by region. The new column is going to be sales total. Tab, count rows. I'm not going to use that. I'm going to use the function sum. And the column to make the sum calculation on is sales. Now when I click OK, there is my preview of my report. There's my name over here. There's the saved steps. I want to close and load to. And I'm going to say a table, yeah. Not a new worksheet. I'm going to put it on this existing worksheet. Click the collapse button. And I'm going to say cell E9 and click OK. Click Load. And just like that, I've created my second query using Power Query in this workbook. I can close this. Now again, this is all dynamic. If I were to change any data here, we could refresh it and boom, it would work. Hey, we didn't even use a pivot table for this. Power Query to clean it up and make a basic report. Now we have one last example. We want to go over to the sheet PQ Power Query Big Data. Now I mentioned the data model earlier here, and I used the term Columnar Database. Actually, if you ever start using Power Pivot or reading about this data model, there's all sorts of synonyms. Power Pivot Database, Columnar Data Model, Excel Data Model, Power Pivot X Velocity Engine, but there they are. Now, our last example is going to be a really amazing one. We want to bring big data into Excel using Power Query, and we're going to add it to the data model, which means that Columnar Database. And the amazing thing about that Columnar Database is it's very efficient in terms of storing. So we're actually going to go look at a file that's about 20 megabytes. And when we import it using Power Query into the data model, it will reduce it down to about 2 megabytes. Not only that, but when we bring it into the data model, it's not going to sit anywhere inside of our spreadsheet. It will actually be saved as a connection, and we're still allowed to make pivot tables from it. Now, what I'm going to do is here's all the steps. I'm going to Control S on this workbook and Control N to open up a new workbook because I want to compare the actual file sizes. Now, I actually Control N to open up a new workbook, and then I saved it, and I called this Import Big Data with Power Query to Connection and Build Pivot Table. Now, I want to jump over to another workbook, and you can download this at the link below the video here. But this is 500,000 rows source data to import. So I'm over in this workbook. If I Control down arrow, that's 500,000 rows. Control up arrow. I'm actually going to close this workbook and go over to Windows Explorer to look. Here's that file I just closed. And look at that, 20 megabytes. And here's the file I just created. It's 8 KB. So let's go back over here, and we're going to use Power Query to import. Now, not from table. We have all sorts of options here. One of them is from file, and this is an Excel file. There is my Excel file I want to import, so I'm going to double click. And here I can see in the navigator, I'm going to select that file. Now, I could come down and click that Edit, and it opens up the Power Query Edit, and I could transform the data in the process of importing. But I want to come down to Load. And I'm going to click the drop-down and be sure and say Load To, because if you click Load, it just puts it into the Excel spreadsheet. I want to say Load To. And there, I'm not going to select Table. I'm going to say Only Create a Connection. And I want to add this to the data model. Those are the two keys here. Again, this simple trick of importing, creating a connection, add to data model will reduce the file size dramatically. Click Load. And there it is. It looks like 499,999 rows. Now, I'm just going to close this, because even though there's a connection, we have access to it through the Pivot Table dialog box. Now, I'm going to come down here and say Final Report. And watch this. Alt-N-V to open up our Pivot Table. We don't have a range, but check this out. We can use an external data source. Now, that data model is considered an external data source, even though it's stored in the Excel file itself. I'm going to choose a connection. And there it is, connections in this workbook, the Power Query. If I click Open and then click OK, and it's going to put it in the existing worksheet on A1, click OK. That is totally amazing. I have access, and it's dynamic. I could refresh it if that data in that other Excel workbook updates. Now I can simply make a simple report. I want products, and I want sales rep. Actually, I think I want sales rep down here, product over here. And all I want is units. And oh my heavens, look at that. I'm going to close this for a second. That is amazing. I'm controlling and rolling. Right click, number formatting. Number with no decimals and a comma. These are units. I'm counting units. And I want to change the final design, report layout to tabular. Wow, that is absolutely amazing. You can see that's a huge pivot table. Control S. And when I go over to Windows Explorer and look at this. The import big data, it's 1.7 megabytes just because we imported it with Power Query and put it into the data model as compared to our original data source. And it's dynamic. If I change any of this and refresh the pivot table over here, boom, it will work. Hey, that was an epic video all about pivot tables for the Northwest Accounting Educators 2015 conference. All right, we'll see you next video.